Okay, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to tackle a word that, let's be honest, most of us probably misunderstand, maybe even dislike a little bit: humility. But what if it isn't about weakness at all? What if it's actually one of the most powerful, life-changing tools we have for building a better, more peaceful life? Well, that's exactly what we're breaking down today. And our journey really kicks off with this one line from our source text. It's so simple and direct, but it puts humility right at the very heart of real, profound personal change. You could say the single idea is the key that unlocks everything else we're about to explore. And that's a fair question, isn't it? For a lot of people, the word humility conjures up some pretty negative images, like groveling or being humiliated. It feels kind of passive, weak, and just totally out of step with the modern world. So to really get a handle on its power, we've got to first understand why so many of us push back against it. And that brings us right to our first section. We're going to take a look at this fundamental clash between how our culture tells us to be successful and what this principle of humility is all about. This slide just lays out that clash perfectly. On one side, you've got the world we live in, right? It celebrates pride, being self-sufficient, and this idea that if we just get enough stuff, enough money, enough security, enough pleasure, we can basically build our own heaven on earth. And then on the other side, you've got humility, an idea that in that context just feels totally alien, maybe even a little unpleasant. So here's the crucial point the source makes. We've made a huge mistake. We've started treating all that material satisfaction not as a way to live a good life, but as the actual goal itself. We've completely flipped the whole purpose of living upside down. And that confusion leads us straight into what the text calls a self-centered trap, a life that's built on a shaky foundation of demands that, deep down, can never really be satisfied. And this just illustrates that cycle brilliantly. It all starts with us demanding more than our fair share of life's good stuff. If we get it, it's never enough. We just up the ante and want more. If we fail, we look for an escape. But either way, the end result is exactly the same: a total loss of perspective. We get trapped in this no-win game that we ourselves created. This quote, wow, it just perfectly captures the feeling of being in that trap. It's that constant, nagging sense that something is missing. The finish line keeps moving because the whole race was flawed from the very beginning. So if that's the trap, how in the world do you get out? Well, the source material is pretty blunt about this. Real change doesn't usually start with some gentle, inspiring moment. It starts with pain. It starts when you have to pay the price of admission. The path out of that trap often begins right here. And we're not talking about just a single bad day. The text describes a whole process of repeated humiliations, life basically showing us over and over and over again that our self-centered way of doing things just isn't working. And these humiliations are followed by a pattern of successive defeats. It's that slow, painful realization that our own willpower, our own smarts, they just aren't enough to control the world and get everything we demand from it. And all of this leads to the final, crushing blow to our own self-sufficiency. This is the moment the ego finally breaks. It's the moment we're forced to admit that the belief that we can do it all ourselves is just an illusion. And by all accounts, it's an incredibly painful place to be. But here's the payoff. This is the crucial part. All that pain, it isn't meaningless. It's transactional. It is the non-negotiable price tag for getting into a brand new way of living and seeing the world. The suffering gets reframed as a purchase, not just a punishment. And once that price has been paid, everything starts to shift. We can finally start to develop a whole new perspective on what humility actually is, and, more importantly, what it can do for us. This slide maps out that journey so well. Humility starts as something you just have to put up with, a forced feeding on humble pie. Then you start to see it as a practical tool, a necessary aid to survival. But then this huge shift happens. It becomes the nourishing ingredient for serenity. And then finally, it transforms into something you actually want, something you actively seek out. And just look at what this new perspective unlocks. We're not just talking about feeling a little bit better here. We're talking about real peace of mind, a profound paradox where we find strength by admitting weakness, and ultimately, what the text calls the true freedom of the human spirit. It's a total game changer. So let's bring this all home. How does this new perspective actually change how we act? Well, it all boils down to this fundamental shift in our approach to life. We start moving from a place of demand to a place of request. The source text is really clear on this. The engine driving all of our problems is this thing called self-centered fear. It's the fear that we won't get what we demand, or the fear that we'll lose what we already have. This fear is what keeps us on the defensive and locks us into that cycle of dissatisfaction. And that fear, it directly leads to a life that's defined by demands. Because we're afraid, we try to control everything. We demand things from ourselves, from the people around us, and from the universe itself. And when those demands, inevitably, are not met, the result is just constant frustration and inner chaos. So we'll end with this thought. The source says the difference between a demand and a simple request is plain to anyone who looks. One is rooted in fear and the need to control. The other is rooted in acceptance and humility. So, looking at your own life, your relationships, your career, your ambitions, which are you making? A demand or a request? The answer might just change everything.